In the chaos of war, there are moments when one man's courage and cunning can turn the tide of battle. On a cold morning in late 1944, Private Samuel Hayes found himself isolated behind enemy lines, facing an entire division of well-trained soldiers. Outnumbered, outgunned, and with no reinforcements in sight, every step he took could mean death. Yet what happened next would become one of the most astonishing stories of strategy, survival, and sheer audacity in World War II. As the enemy closed in, Hayes began a sequence of maneuvers so bold, so precise, that it would leave commanders on both sides stunned. Every decision, every calculation mattered. One mistake and it was over. But Hayes had something that no map, no artillery, and no training could teach: instinct. In this story, you'll witness how a single soldier, armed with nothing but his wits and a rifle, outsmarted an entire enemy division. By the end, you'll understand why some legends of the battlefield aren't just remembered, they're impossible to forget. Private Hayes crouched in the shadow of a ruined farmhouse, heart pounding, every sound amplified in the frozen morning air. Smoke from distant artillery hung in the valley like a gray shroud, and the distant clatter of enemy boots echoed through the narrow streets. He knew the division he faced was relentless, a well-coordinated force that had crushed everything in its path for weeks. Hayes had seen the aftermath, villages flattened, comrades captured or worse, and now he was alone. Every instinct screamed at him to hide, to run, but he also knew that fleeing would only make him predictable, a target waiting to be claimed. He took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs, and ran through a mental checklist. The enemy had superior numbers, vehicles, and artillery. His rifle was standard issue, nothing fancy. He had no radios, no backup, no clear map of the enemy's positions. All he had was the terrain in his mind. Hayes began studying the street layout, the broken fences, the collapsed walls. Each ruin offered both cover and risk, each shadow a potential hiding spot or death trap. He knew that to survive, he would have to think like the enemy while acting like someone invisible. Movement caught his eye, a patrol moving along the main road, rifles held loosely but ready. The soldiers were disciplined, scanning every corner, every alley. Hayes realized that charging them head-on was suicide. Instead, he needed to manipulate them, make them believe there were threats where there were none. Every step he took had to be measured, deliberate. He crept along a narrow path behind a toppled cart, counting breaths, listening to the crunch of boots in the distance. He waited until the patrol passed, timing his movements to the rhythm of their footsteps. Every second of delay was a second gained toward survival. Hayes found a vantage point atop the crumbling wall of a bombed-out barn. From here, he could see three main approaches into the village. He positioned himself carefully, moving only when absolutely necessary. His eyes scanned constantly, catching glints of helmets, shadows, and the occasional glimmer of a bayonet. Time stretched in this tense game of cat and mouse. He knew one wrong move would reveal him instantly, and the entire division could sweep through the village in minutes. Yet Hayes had a plan, a sequence of maneuvers he had been thinking through since he realized he was cut off from his unit. He began setting small traps, loose boards, debris, anything that could produce sound without endangering him. When the first group of enemy soldiers approached, a strategically dropped plank creaked underfoot. Instantly, the patrol froze, rifles raised, scanning the darkness. Hayes ducked behind a pile of rubble, suppressing his own breathing, watching as they circled, checking the noise, then moving on cautiously. One by one, he guided them with subtle distractions, noises, and shadows, making them believe the village was crawling with hidden resistance. Hours passed like days. Hayes moved silently from ruin to ruin, marking paths and noting enemy patterns. He discovered that the division had a routine: supply trucks every 2 hours, foot patrols in staggered shifts, and heavy weapon units resting at the edge of the village during daylight. Using this knowledge, he began predicting movements, setting false trails, and isolating small groups. Each maneuver increased his confidence, but he never let his guard down. This was not a game. One misstep would cost him his life. Yet, in the quiet, calculated tension, Hayes found a rhythm. He became a phantom in the ruins, a shadow the enemy couldn't grasp, a ghost in their midst. By late afternoon, Hayes had created confusion among the enemy ranks. Small patrols reported imagined ambushes, supply trucks were rerouted, and commanders grew frustrated with the lack of progress. Hayes had turned fear and uncertainty into his weapon, using the enemy's OWN expectations against them. He was not just surviving, he was shaping the battlefield, forcing an entire division to move as he dictated. Every sound, every movement, every fleeting shadow was part of his intricate game. As night approached, the division began to consolidate, attempting to surround the village and flush out any remaining threats. Hayes, exhausted but focused, knew this was the moment to execute the most daring part of his plan. He identified a key supply route, heavily guarded but predictable. With careful timing, he lured small squads into ambush points he had previously prepared. The results were catastrophic for the enemy: confusion, fear, and a cascade of tactical errors. One soldier after another stumbled into traps, shotguns or rifles, picking off anyone who underestimated the phantom in the ruins. Hayes moved like water, never staying in one spot long enough to be targeted, striking precisely and disappearing again into shadows. By midnight, the division commander was forced to call off the sweep. Reports flooded in of unseen snipers, booby traps, and the mysterious disappearance of key patrols. Hayes, unseen and undetected, had outmaneuvered a force dozens of times larger than himself. Every decision, every risk he had taken had paid off. He survived the night not just by luck, but through cunning, courage, and an intimate understanding of human behavior under stress. The enemy division, though massive, had been thoroughly outsmarted by one determined private. Hayes' survival would later be studied as a masterclass in unconventional warfare, demonstrating that even in the most impossible circumstances, one individual could alter the course of events entirely. Dawn broke with a pale, ghostly light filtering through the remnants of the village. The streets were eerily silent, littered with debris and abandoned gear. Hayes moved cautiously, each step measured, knowing the enemy could regroup at any moment. Though exhausted from the previous night's maneuvering, his mind was sharper than ever. Survival wasn't just about hiding, it was about anticipating the enemy, predicting their decisions, and exploiting their weaknesses. Hayes paused behind a shattered wall, surveying the terrain. The division's retreat from the central streets was temporary. They would return more cautious, more aggressive. He needed to strike decisively to maintain his advantage. He began analyzing their patterns, when reinforcements would arrive, which roads they would take, and how they communicated. Without radios, Hayes relied on observation, intuition, and a deep understanding of military behavior. Every patrol, every supply convoy, every footstep told a story. He listened to that story, absorbing it, shaping his next moves around it. He discovered a critical vulnerability. The enemy relied heavily on a single communication line to coordinate movements across the village. If Hayes could disrupt it, confusion would ripple through their ranks. The idea sparked a dangerous opportunity. Moving under the cover of shadows, he approached a partially destroyed outpost where wires snaked along the walls. With trembling hands, he dismantled connections, carefully avoiding wires that might trigger alarms. Each second stretched unbearably, the risk of discovery looming like a storm cloud overhead. A snapped wire, a misstep, and the enemy could detect his presence instantly. Yet his precision paid off. The main line was severed, and the enemy's communication became fragmented, forcing them to rely on slower, less coordinated methods. The effect was immediate. Small units began moving independently, uncertain, hesitant. Orders were delayed, messages misinterpreted. Hayes used this to his advantage, laying out traps and diversions. A cleverly placed flare here, a noise there, and soldiers found themselves moving into positions they believed were safe, only to encounter sudden resistance from a direction they didn't anticipate. Hayes had become a ghost general, directing the battlefield without ever being seen. He never engaged in direct confrontation unless it was unavoidable. Instead, he let fear, confusion, and uncertainty do the work for him. Hours passed as Hayes orchestrated his silent war. He moved from vantage point to vantage point, always aware of the shifting patterns of enemy movement. At one point, a squad of 10 soldiers approached, rifles raised, sweeping the streets for signs of resistance. Hayes allowed them to advance, using a broken crate to conceal his position. Then, with a sudden noise, something as simple as the clatter of metal on stone, they stumbled into a pit he had prepared earlier, a small trench camouflaged with rubble and leaves. The squad was trapped, bewildered, and disoriented. Hayes slipped away before they could regroup, leaving chaos in his wake. By midday, Hayes' actions had created a ripple effect throughout the division. The enemy commanders were frustrated, unable to understand why our forces were faltering. Reports of phantom snipers, traps, and unpredictable attacks spread fear among the troops. Morale plummeted and hesitation replaced aggression. Hayes recognized this moment as pivotal. He decided to exploit the fear he had cultivated. Carefully, he maneuvered through narrow alleys, setting visual cues and shadows that suggested an even larger force was hiding nearby. The enemy, already unnerved by previous losses, began to question their strategy, believing they faced an organized resistance when, in reality, Hayes was alone. Every step Hayes took required careful calculation. Food and water were scarce, and fatigue weighed heavily on him. Yet adrenaline and focus kept him moving. He found small caches of supplies left by retreating villagers, cans of rations, bottles of water, and rationed them carefully. Even survival necessities became part of his tactical advantage. Leaving signs of activity, tracks, and false trails further reinforced the illusion of a hidden force. Hayes had learned that psychological warfare could be as lethal as bullets. If the enemy believed they faced a larger, more organized opponent, they would make mistakes. Late in the afternoon, Hayes identified a critical junction, the only route through which reinforcements could arrive from the north. He positioned himself with a clear line of sight, using the ruins for cover. He waited patiently, watching shadows shift and listening to distant commands. Hours passed, and finally a small convoy approached, unaware of the trap set before them. Hayes struck with precision, disabling vehicles and forcing the soldiers into chaos. Panic spread through the convoy, disrupting the flow of reinforcements and leaving the division increasingly vulnerable. Each calculated strike reinforced Hayes' dominance over a battlefield far larger than himself. As evening descended, Hayes reflected on the magnitude of what he had accomplished. One private, alone against an entire enemy division, had manipulated movements, disrupted communication, and created fear among hundreds of soldiers. His actions had prevented a larger catastrophe for his own forces and demonstrated the extraordinary potential of courage, cunning, and careful observation. Yet Hayes remained vigilant tonight, like every night could bring danger. Sleep was a luxury he could not afford, and the shadow of the enemy loomed persistently. By nightfall, the division commander made a critical decision: withdraw and regroup. Confused reports of unseen attackers, traps, and miscommunications had sown enough doubt that remaining in the village was too risky. Hayes had survived, yes, but more than that, he had forced a force many times his size to retreat. In the quiet that followed, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, realizing the power of one determined individual to alter the course of events. Each trap, each calculated risk, each shadow had contributed to this improbable victory. Hayes had not merely survived, he had dominated. The night was thick with fog, a ghostly blanket that wrapped the village in silence. Hayes moved carefully through the shadows, his senses heightened. Every creak of timber, every rustle of leaves could signal danger. But now, after a full day of orchestrating confusion, he was no longer merely surviving, he was controlling the battlefield. Each movement was deliberate, each pause strategic. The enemy had no idea he was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Their confusion, their fear, their hesitation were the silent weapons he wielded. Hayes observed the enemy from a ruined rooftop, crouched behind the remnants of a collapsed chimney. Soldiers patrolled the streets below, their flashlights cutting through the fog. They moved cautiously, constantly checking their surroundings, yet they were unaware of the traps he had laid just hours earlier. Hayes studied their formations and timing, noting where the division's weaknesses lay. Even in his exhaustion, his mind remained razor-sharp. This was a chessboard, and every piece the enemy moved only played into his hands. He had realized that the psychological edge was more potent than brute force. One small strike here, one well-placed misdirection there, and an entire unit could be paralyzed with indecision. The enemy was beginning to doubt everything they saw, and Hayes knew that doubt could be fatal. He began setting up false positions, crumbling barricades that suggested ambushes, noises that seemed to indicate larger forces moving unseen, and footprints that led nowhere but appeared to confirm enemy presence. Every calculated step further amplified their fear. Hours later, Hayes discovered a key opportunity. The enemy had set up a temporary command post in the central square, using the ruins of a town hall as their base. From his concealed vantage, he could see officers coordinating movements, relying on fragmented communication lines he had already compromised. It was risky, but he recognized the potential for decisive disruption. If he could incapacitate the command center, the division would descend into chaos. He planned meticulously, tracing patrol patterns, noting guard rotations, and identifying weak points. Using the darkness and fog to his advantage, Hayes approached the square. He deployed small improvised distractions, throwing stones in one direction, setting small fires in another, creating the illusion of larger forces converging. Soldiers scrambled to respond to multiple threats at once, their communication breaking down further. Hayes slipped through the cracks, bypassing patrols with near-invisible precision. Every step, every breath had to be calculated. One misstep could cost him everything. Finally, he reached a vantage point overlooking the command post. Hayes set small, timed explosives, enough to disable vehicles, destroy vital equipment, and sow panic, but not to cause large-scale casualties. He retreated into shadow, heart pounding as he waited. When the charges detonated, the resulting chaos was immediate. Officers shouted commands that were never executed, radios went silent, and soldiers stumbled over each other in confusion. Hayes watched from above, a single figure shaping the course of the battle without ever being seen. By dawn, the enemy's structure was shattered. Reinforcements had been delayed, the chain of command disrupted, and fear had taken root. Hayes knew he had only one chance to capitalize. If he pressed too hard, he could risk detection. If he waited too long, the enemy might recover. He decided to continue psychological warfare, exploiting their uncertainty. Every shadow he cast, every noise he made, suggested a growing presence that didn't exist. Soldiers became hesitant, cautious, second-guessing every order. Hayes had effectively turned an entire division against itself, and all it took was one private's calculated strategy. Throughout the day, Hayes moved like a phantom. He sabotaged supply lines, redirected small patrols into dead ends, and maintained an almost supernatural presence in the minds of the enemy. At one point, a group of soldiers attempted to secure a bridge essential for reinforcements. Hayes, using an abandoned building for cover, created diversions on both ends of the bridge. The soldiers hesitated, unsure of where the threat lay, allowing him to disable the bridge just long enough to delay their movements significantly. Each minor victory contributed to a larger tapestry of confusion. By midday, Hayes' legend had begun to spread among the enemy. Whispers of a phantom soldier circulated, tales of someone who struck without warning, disappeared without a trace, and seemed to be everywhere at once. These stories, fueled by fear and uncertainty, became as potent as any weapon. Hayes understood the power of perception and ensured it worked entirely in his favor. Small, deliberate signs were left behind, footprints that led nowhere, fires that suggested large-scale presence, and objects moved to suggest lurking forces. The enemy saw what Hayes wanted them to see, never realizing it was only him. Exhaustion threatened to take him, but Hayes refused to rest. He found small nooks in abandoned homes and crumbling walls to catch a few moments of rest, always listening, always calculating. Each action required careful energy management. His meals were tiny, rationed carefully, and every movement consumed precious calories. Yet his mind never wavered. Survival was not enough. The enemy had to be outmaneuvered at every turn. Hayes became a one-man army, invisible yet omnipresent, exploiting fear, confusion, and tactical advantage. Late in the afternoon, Hayes observed a critical opportunity. A detachment of the division, unaware of the command post's destruction, was moving through the northern sector. Hayes positioned himself along a narrow alleyway, hidden among rubble and shadow. He created a diversion to draw half the detachment away, then struck with precision, disabling vehicles and forcing the remaining soldiers into disarray. Panic spread like wildfire. The enemy's carefully coordinated plans unraveled in real time, giving Hayes' side the advantage without a single direct confrontation. As dusk fell, the village was silent once more, but Hayes knew the night would bring new challenges. He moved through the streets with deliberate caution, noting every change, every potential threat. The division had been outwitted, yes, but Hayes could not afford overconfidence. One small mistake could undo everything he had accomplished. He relied on every skill he had developed, every lesson learned, to maintain his invisible dominance over a battlefield far larger than any individual should control. By nightfall, the enemy division began a chaotic retreat. Officers struggled to communicate with fragmented units, soldiers hesitated, unsure of the danger ahead, and Hayes remained unseen, orchestrating every twist and turn. One private had turned the tide of an entire operation, using intellect, observation, and cunning to compensate for the lack of numbers. He had become the embodiment of strategic ingenuity, demonstrating that courage and brains often outweighed brute strength on the battlefield. As night deepened, Hayes pressed his advantage. The enemy division, now fractured and demoralized, moved like a herd without a shepherd. Every decision delayed, every step hesitant. Hayes remained unseen, a ghost among shadows, exploiting every hesitation. He knew the key to final victory lay not in brute force, but in sustaining the illusion of overwhelming presence. He used the village's terrain to his benefit. Narrow streets, crumbling buildings, and ruined walls became both shield and stave. He began setting small, strategic traps, each one carefully calculated to cause disruption without endangering himself. Rocks positioned to create noise, doors left ajar to suggest a larger force, and small fires ignited to indicate troop movements, all contributed to the perception of an omnipresent adversary. Hayes watched from concealed vantage points as the enemy panicked at imagined threats. Every soldier, convinced they were being surrounded, hesitated. Orders were delayed, and inaction became the enemy's greatest enemy. The private's most daring move came when he realized that the enemy was attempting to regroup in the town square. If left unchecked, they might restore some semblance of command and recover their morale. Hayes knew that striking directly would be too risky. Instead, he orchestrated a series of distractions across multiple points simultaneously. Fires blazed in empty buildings. False patrols were simulated with makeshift noises, and debris was used to create the illusion of approaching reinforcements. The enemy division, already on edge, fell completely into disarray. Amid the chaos, Hayes focused on key officers he had previously observed. He used carefully thrown objects and timed noises to make them believe the command post was under assault. Officers shouted orders, but the soldiers, unsure of which threats were real, froze. Confusion reigned, and Hayes remained unseen. His ability to manipulate perception had effectively turned an entire division against itself. Every hesitant step by the enemy widened the advantage he had created. By early morning, the division's cohesion had crumbled. Hayes seized the opportunity to sabotage remaining supply lines. He disabled vehicles, destroyed communication equipment, and set minor explosions to block key routes. Each action, though small in isolation, compounded into a catastrophic failure for the enemy. Soldiers, fatigued and frightened, struggled to comprehend the situation. Their carefully rehearsed strategy had been shattered by a single private, whose courage and ingenuity defied belief. Throughout the day, Hayes continued his relentless campaign of deception. He avoided direct confrontation, knowing that his strength lay in remaining unseen. Instead, he created the illusion of multiple forces converging from all directions. Footsteps echoed where no one was, shadows moved along the periphery, and sounds suggested the presence of entire squads. The enemy division, convinced they were surrounded and outnumbered, retreated in confusion. Hayes' tactics had not only neutralized a formidable force, but had also inflicted psychological defeat that would last long after the battle ended. One pivotal moment came when a small detachment of enemy soldiers attempted to flank what they thought was a larger opposing force. Hayes, hidden among ruins, simulated reinforcements arriving from the opposite direction. He created movement with debris, threw stones at intervals, and used makeshift signals that suggested coordinated attacks. The detachment halted, uncertain of the threat, and eventually withdrew. Each step the enemy took seemed to validate Hayes' phantom presence. He had become a master of battlefield manipulation, controlling events without exposing himself to danger. By the end of the second day, the division was in full retreat. Hayes observed from a hidden rooftop as officers struggled to regroup their scattered forces. He could see the exhaustion and fear etched on their faces. He allowed them a brief moment to realize the scale of their defeat, knowing that panic and confusion were more effective than any physical engagement. Hayes' strategy had relied on intellect, observation, and psychological manipulation rather than numbers or firepower. News of the private's actions eventually reached his own command. For them, the story seemed unbelievable. How could a single individual disrupt an entire enemy division, delay reinforcements, destroy critical supplies, and maintain complete invisibility? Yet the evidence was clear. The enemy had suffered massive operational failures, and Hayes' ingenuity had rewritten the battle's outcome. For Hayes, there was no time for celebration. Every success had been built on precise calculation, constant vigilance, and an intimate understanding of both the enemy and the terrain. In the aftermath, military analysts would later study Hayes' actions, recognizing them as a rare example of tactical brilliance on a personal scale. He had demonstrated that the power of one soldier armed with knowledge, patience, and cunning could outweigh the advantage of hundreds or even thousands. Every trap, diversion, and feigned presence had contributed to a cascading effect, a chain reaction that dismantled the enemy from within. Hayes' survival was remarkable, but his victory lay not just in living, it lay in the control he exerted over an entire battlefield. The enemy division, humiliated and scattered, left behind supplies, equipment, and morale broken beyond repair. Hayes used the night to ensure no residual threat remained. He dismantled remaining traps, secured abandoned equipment, and moved silently through the village, ensuring that no evidence could compromise future operations. His mission was not only a triumph of skill, but also a lesson in strategy, illustrating that courage combined with intellect could achieve the impossible. When Hayes finally returned to his unit, he was met with disbelief and awe. His comrades listened in astonishment as he recounted the nightmarish 2 days of stealth, strategy, and psychological warfare. For them, Hayes was no longer merely a private. He had become a symbol of ingenuity and courage, someone who had reshaped the outcome of a battle through sheer intellect and relentless determination. Reflecting on the operation, Hayes understood the delicate balance between risk and reward. Every misstep could have led to disaster, yet every calculated move had amplified his advantage. He had proven that the battlefield was not only a contest of strength, but also a stage for intellect, deception, and psychological mastery. In the end, one soldier had outwitted an entire division, demonstrating that true power often lies not in numbers, but in skill, patience, and the courage to act when others hesitate. If Hayes' daring and ingenuity blew your mind, don't just scroll away. Hit that like button and subscribe to witness more incredible stories of courage, strategy, and the soldiers who changed history. Share this video with anyone who loves true tales of battlefield brilliance, and leave a comment telling us which moment shocked you the most. Every story like Hayes reminds us that one determined individual can defy the impossible, and we've got even more jaw-dropping accounts waiting for you.